Hi there, and welcome back to SciBurst, a podcast about science, popular culture, and entertainment. We're your hosts, Ella
and Isabel, two science communicators and sci-fi nerds steering this spaceship into the multiverse of science fun. Today's episode, elemental powers,
Stop it.
ancient chemistry, and magic science.
Is that magic with a K?
Yeah.
And a G and an I and a C and a K?
Yes, it is.
So much fun. As always, we're going to start by jumping into some recommendations. But before that, it's really important that we acknowledge that this episode of SciBurst is being recorded on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Indigenous Australians are the first scientists and artists, and we'd like to pay our respects to elders past, present, emerging, and future.
So Culture Snap. What do you have for us today, Ella?
So exciting. My culture snap today is NaNoWriMo, which, if you haven't heard of it, it's this thing called National Novel Writing Month. In the month of November, there's this massive online community that encourages you to write a first draft of a novel, traditionally, and that is 50,000 words over the course of the month of November. And my culture snap is recommending to consider giving it a go this year. It's lots of fun. I've done it a few times. Sometimes I hit the goal of 50K, sometimes I don't. The community is super supportive. They've got heaps of resources to help you write. If you're in like a big city kind of area, there's lots of like catch-up events. In Canberra, you can do a write-in session at the National Library with other people who are doing NaNoWriMo.
Oh, I didn't know they did it.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
It's really, really cool. Everyone who does it is super fun. So if you want to feel supported in getting like a first draft of a book or similar writing out there, highly encourage you to consider doing NaNoWriMo starting November 1st.
And so you said 50,000.
50,000 words.
That's a lot in a month because an honours thesis is like 25. There's like half that over the course of 9 months.
Yeah, but it's like 1,667 words a day.
That's still a lot.
Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like as researched as one sentence in an honours thesis, which has to have like 6 references.
That's true. I guess if you have a really good novel, like concept for a novel, then you can go in and probably write it relatively fast.
It's just a draft. It's just an exercise to get words on paper so that you feel motivated in finishing.
Like the shut up and write sessions for theses.
NaNoWriMo is basically shut up and write for 30 days straight. Yeah, that's my culture snap. Isabel, what's yours?
Yeah, okay, something I've only recently discovered called blackout poetry, where you get a piece of paper that's already got words on it, or like an, I don't know, old magazine or something, and you form the poem by just choosing words already on the paper and black out the rest of the text.
So like taking a black marker.
Yeah, black marker, black texter. Some people will like put piece of paper over it. You can actually get creative. So in that, it's sort of 2 art styles combined into one. I like it because it constrains you in your poetry, and you end up sort of creating poetry on topics you wouldn't usually write about naturally, because you're working with what's already there. And I also find it less overwhelming than starting a poem from scratch where you've got like a blank piece of paper with no words on it. Also, super fun activity if you maybe receive a pamphlet from a particular person or political party you don't like, and instead of throwing out the piece of paper, you can turn it into poetry.
Turn it into art.
Yeah, exactly.
That's super fun. I've seen funny versions online where someone takes a piece of Swiss cheese and throws it down on the paper to see where the holes align, like what words with. I think that's cool.
That's fun. I actually want to try that now. It sounds like a fun activity.
Do you know what else is a fun activity?
What?
Our episode today.
Yeah, it is.
So our podcast topic today is all about the elements. When we're talking about elements, we're talking kind of about key core elements and how they've popped up in popular culture and science and history and art throughout time. Usually some variations of earth, water, wind, fire. Sometimes there's like a fifth element.
Yes.
Lots of fun things there. It kind of permeates pop culture to the nth degree at the moment, to the point that academic articles are now using it as like a punchy title. So this kind of had origins in early sciences and natural philosophy, and then was taken by people and turned into pop culture alongside that. And that's kind of been the main dominant force, so much so that now science is using it to kind of get almost like street cred and excitement into their titles. So there's some people and places using it, such as the European Corrosion Congress.
Oh.
In 2015, they had a conference called Earth, Water, Fire, Air, Corrosion Happens Everywhere, which I think is super fun. Water, Air, Fire and Earth, a developmental study in Portugal of environmental moral reasoning.
Oh.
Interesting study title. And also lots and lots of eco-criticism that comes out of framing through these elements, which I think is super interesting. So that's kind of like a snapshot of where science looks at the moment with elements and kind of like meta science pop culture.
Yeah. So these elements are what we today call the classical elements or the primal elements, because of course they're not the actual
periodic table of elements.
Yes. Yeah. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But there's a movie that just came out. Disney Pixar's Elementals, which Isabel and I went and saw last weekend. Yeah, by the time this comes out, though, it would have been like a month or two.
Ages ago. It's still in cinemas.
Yeah.
And honestly, going into it, I don't think we had super high expectations.
No, I didn't really know what I was going in to watch.
I'd seen the advertisements, and it kind of advertises the movie as like a Romeo and Juliet type situation, where you have the elements, and they kind of are classical elements as a stand-in for hatred / we know they don't mix, so kind of like the Montague Capulet, the houses are feuding, and very much plays on the physical and aesthetic differences between, I guess, these types of characters, such as water and fire and wind people.
Yeah.
The appearance and aesthetic is very much kind of inside out emotions meets Romeo and Juliet kind of storyline. Pixar doing their classic, what if blank non-human thing had feelings? This one was what if elements had feelings? Pixar does it so well. I think we both had a great time at the movies.
Yeah.
Watching it. Thank you, Hannah, for the recommendation, because honestly, I don't think I would have seen it without you telling me that you think I'd love it. And as always, she is right about my movie choice. But we thought it was a very interesting lens to jump into this topic through, considering that film was just released and is embedded in so much of this history about elements appearing in science, history, philosophy, popular culture for years and years and years and years.
Yeah. So interesting. The director, Peterson,
Yeah, Peterson, I think.
Peterson. He got the idea of the movie partly from the periodic table.
Love a science king.
Because when he was first learning about the periodic table, when he was looking at it, all he saw were apartment buildings. Like it just looked like a bunch of apartment complexes.
Oh, I see that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the blocks and the different atomic numbers and the names to him were like families and people who lived in these apartments. And so he would come up with jokes to remember the different elements.
That's a great memory technique to use.
Yeah, it's very smart. And it's actually something they do recommend in science to remember concepts.
Stories with concepts.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And so one of them was copper lives next to helium, but don't trust helium because they're gassy. Coming up with jokes for the other elements was a little bit hard. So for the purposes of the movie, he ended up focusing on the classical primal elements, which are earth, fire, water, air.
Which is great conceptually for a children's movie. And also reduces the amount of moving parts you have, because the periodic table of elements has a lot more than 4.
Yes. Yeah, and it's not just the elements either. It's all the different numbers and whatnot that it can be overwhelming to understand to people who are outside of science.
Yeah, but this is kind of, I guess, like an interesting introduction to it because it does go back to its foundations, right?
Yeah, and I wanted to cover a little bit of the history of chemistry to give some context of how we got from the earth, fire, water thing to the periodic table.
Yeah, please do. I'm super interested.
So it was actually our guy Aristotle.
Old mate Aristotle.
Ancient Greek philosopher. You've probably heard his name before. He was the one who came up with the idea that all pure substances were made from 4 different elements: earth, air, water, fire.
Yep.
And this was a really long time ago as well. So we're talking about 300 BCE.
That's so many years ago.
Yeah. So that's pretty amazing for back then. And so alongside that, he also came up with the idea that there were also 2 pairs of contrasting qualities. So you have hot or cold and wet or dry.
So like each element was either hot or cold.
Yeah.
And wet or dry.
Yes, exactly. So things like metals and sand were earths. Blood was a water with a little bit of fire because of the role in sustaining life.
And all the colour.
Colour too. Yeah. Yes. And then the alchemists a little bit later on added salt, sulfur and mercury, which is what Ella was saying earlier about how there were a few others.
Yeah,
added in early chemistry.
Sometimes interesting ones pop up even in popular culture too, which I guess we'll cover a little bit later.
Mm-hmm. So this is a relatively simplistic theory in the realms of science, but it actually dominated scientific thought in chemistry for centuries, for quite a long time.
Yeah, like it's rudimentary now with what we know.
Yes.
But it was, I guess kind of like the building blocks to what we do know now.
Yeah, exactly. So it definitely laid the philosophical groundwork for all discussions later of elements chemistry and what eventually became the periodic table. And it's actually used as an introduction to chemistry in Western science classes in Australia. At least that was my experience.
Not with me, but I entered chemistry kind of late. I only did it in like year 11, 12. But I kind of wish I'd had this intro. I like how cool it'd be to listen to this podcast and then be able to tie chemistry to popular culture and then get more excited about what you're learning in the real world because you know how it applies to concepts you already have a grounding in.
Mm-hmm.
I love science communication. It's so cool. An interesting thought I had is that all the zodiacs kind of fall into the classical elements.
Yeah.
Like fire signs. So I think that's fun that they've transposed there too.
That's also the thing of astrology and astronomy being like way back.
Being linked.
Yeah. Right? That's science. Magic link. Wink, wink. We'll talk about throughout this episode.
So many teasers for upcoming interesting topics.
And you found this comic, Ella, that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah. The XKCD, a classic webcomic group, have this very, very funny comic where one character says, "I'm the Avatar, master of all 4 elements." And then another character, and this character kind of like, the one who says that looks very pop culture-y, looks like they're from Avatar The Last Airbender, versus kind of like a more scientific, grey, fuzzling hair kind of image of a scientist character. He says, "Really? I'm Mendeleev, master of all 18 plus."
So yeah, Mendeleev was one of the...
Mendeleev.
Yeah, it's Mendeleev.
Mendeleev.
I think Russian. The pioneer of the periodic table.
I think it's very fun that other people have drawn these parallels before, and it makes sense, and I'm excited to explore that further.
So, what I was saying before, science and magic, now two very separate things. But way back, they were very intertwined. And I wrote about this in my honours thesis. And when I was researching, found that some magical thinking informed the basis of lots of modern scientific practices in the West.
Whoa, cool.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I'm talking about magic in a sense of a belief in human creative powers that let us manipulate nature and produce marvelous effects. So not like stage magic, that more sort of spiritual kind. One really common example is alchemy, which listeners, you may have heard of the magical pursuit of alchemists to transform base metals into gold or silver.
Yeah.
To create more value out of them. Of course, they were never successful in doing this, but it actually led to the development of early forms of fire assay, which is a method we use today to determine concentrations of gold and platinum group elements in ores and alloys. So that's kind of cool.
Really cool that came from it, because I think a lot of opinions of alchemists in popular culture is that of like the conman. But it's cool to know that that was kind of like a different breed of alchemist, kind of like exaggerated by popular culture.
Yeah.
But kind of like the basis of it was something that continued to inform scientific practices, and was just kind of like an exploration of, I don't want to say transmutation because it's such an alchemist kind of word, but they were kind of just like exploring the elements, see what could happen, and how to purify substances, which is incredibly helpful, and a lot of people spend a lot of time, research, money right now in our world doing that.
Yeah, exactly. So they didn't reach the original goal they wanted, but they, in the process, came up with lots of ways that helped progress science.
Yeah, which is so cool.
Yeah, it is. And on the magic and science thing, elements as superpowers.
Wow, have you ever heard of that trope before?
Giant trope in pop culture. Love this idea of science as a magical superpower. As well, and using these science concepts and portraying them as a power, basically, and potentially using the magic system or magic systems to excite people about science and classification systems and making science seem fun.
Yeah, and kind of drawing out the most interesting bits of it. And how things link together, I think, is also how elements come into play a lot. One of my favorite examples of elemental powers being used, and I think kind of the one that comes to a lot of people's heads, especially if you're in our generation, is Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yeah.
Which is such a classic kids' TV show about groups of people, nations, if you will, who all... each have people who can bend, which is kind of manipulate a different element, with the character of the avatar being one person kind of per generation who is able to learn all the elemental manipulation techniques and bend all the elements. It is a sensational story, and all the characters and all the different nations have their own type of fighting styles and moves relevant to the cultures of these nations. So it's cool to see that embedded into the history of these people in a fictional world. I think a lot of times elemental powers are kind of used as like here you go, have this.
Yeah.
It's a mechanic job done. But I think the creators of this show do a really good job of embedding it in a way that it means something to the characters to have that association. And kind of like if you're a bender in this world, if you can manipulate the elements, you're kind of like a master. Not everyone can do it. It's quite special. And really interestingly, I hadn't really thought about this too much before this episode, is that elemental bending is heavily, heavily dependent on spirituality.
Oh.
Which is really interesting because of the classical roots of, I guess the classical elements are basically... in Avatar, The Last Airbender world, the percentage of benders in a population depends on how spiritual a population is. So the air nomads, they have a really, really high percentage of benders to the Earth Nation, and they have a low percentage of benders because they're not as spiritually connected, which is super interesting. It's really cool too to see how each of the nations live in harmony with their element, and I think we can see, that these elements are very grounded in natural sciences. Grounded should have been an intended pun. I am going to claim that. And there's kind of like this knowledge and responsibility that should come with elemental bending as part of the storyline. So if you're a bender, you should acknowledge, your responsibility to not only the history of that, but also how you impact the environment. And I think that's very interesting considering how a lot of modern science papers use this as a way into eco-criticism.
Yes. Fascinating.
So fascinating.
And with the spiritual connection, what does spiritual connection and spirituality look like in this show? Like, is it a religious thing, or is it more your connection with nature? Meditative?
Very meditative, relating to kind of like the spiritual realm. So they do have kind of like spiritual projecting as plot points and a mechanism within this world. And long ago, kind of on a Promethean pathway, other creatures, spirits bestowed bending to people. And the first one that was bestowed was fire. And that person didn't give the fire bending back. Kind of like Prometheus stealing fire in the Greek myth, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah. Oh, cool. It's all coming back to me now because I haven't watched Last Airbender in a very long time. So thank you for refreshing my memory, and I will probably have to go rewatch it all.
Yeah, I think you should. I kind of want to. I haven't seen Legend of Korra yet, and I'd really like to.
Yeah, some people really like that as well.
Yeah. One of the last thing I'll touch on is that there are also sub-bending styles. So acknowledging kind of like the four main elements, and then there's like this bonus energy bending concept that is quite pivotal to plot. There are sub-bending styles that come out of those four main ones, such as healing, which is a specific type of water bending application, or metal bending, which again is kind of like a type of like a subsection of earth bending. There's also lightning bending, which the Fire Nation can use. And I think that's really interesting because a lot of popular culture will kind of like start with the main elements and then be like, if we have more characters, they can't have the same powers and branch out. Whereas this world is very much grounded in the classical elements, and growth or new areas sit within those classifications, not really outside of them.
Yeah, that's interesting that those other those sub-bending styles are more in the realm of alchemy as well.
Oh, true.
That's cool.
That is really cool.
So there's lots of other pop culture that uses elemental superpowers, like Fantastic Four, so many superhero.
Pretty much every superhero dynasty, I guess.
But
X-Men? Sorry, what? So who said that?
One that's got me kind of excited that I didn't expect to get excited about was
We've been texting about it all week.
Yeah, the Winx Club.
So good.
That show very
had a
much
hold on me.
Oh yeah, it was a huge part of my childhood. I don't think we talked about it in our STEM Girls episode, but we should have.
We should have.
So maybe Winx Club will get its own episode one day. We'll see.
we live in hope.
So I am talking about the original Italian cartoon animated series, which was set in a magical universe inhabited by fairies and other magical creatures.
So whimsical. I love.
It was. And the protagonist is a teen fairy called Bloom, who enrolls at a college to train and hone her skills, her fairy skills, and befriends a bunch of fellow teen fairies who become the Winx Club and fight evil witches and creatures. Love this show. recently turned into a live action, which I refuse to watch.
I heard it was a bit of a flop.
Yeah. They're probably not making another season, are they? Do they have money?
I don't know.
I don't know. Anyway, animated series was great. Some of the fairy types in the series are actually based off the classical Aristotle elements.
Hell yeah.
So you have earth fairies, you have fire fairies, water fairies, air fairies. The protagonist, Bloom, is a fire fairy, and she's known for her iconic dragon flame power, which is her like ultimate power.
Form.
Yeah. From my memory, I can imagine it's this like dragon that forms it out of fire, like fire into the shape of a dragon. Yeah.
All I remember is I was confused how the color of her powers didn't align with the color of her clothes.
Oh, because she wears a blue. Yeah.
I think it's very interesting that a lot of media about elemental powers associates fire with red, and that's the only color any of those characters wear, so you can associate them with that.
She did have red hair, though.
She did have red hair, but I would say I forget that detail. Like, that seems less relevant than the color of her clothes.
Yeah.
Because that was, like, very, very prominent. And you have, like, the transformations.
Yes.
Which, again, so iconic. And the transformation was kind of like when she's about to, like, use her big power.
Yeah. It'd probably look really bad if we rewatched it now, because I have this, great image of it from when I was a child watching it, and it would probably not look as good if I watched it today.
In my head, those transformations were everything.
Yeah, I know. And the music as well. It adds to the magic of the elements.
So you said some of the fairies are based on the classical elements. Mm-hmm. What about the other ones?
Yeah, so there's a whole lot of others. For example, we have nature fairies. Mm-hmm. So we have the one who has a plant powers.
Which is different to ground.
Yeah.
Let's just put that out there.
Yeah. We have sound fairies.
So cool as a concept.
Yes. And this one, technology fairies. This I find fascinating.
Iconic.
And I don't know how we missed this in our STEM Girls episode.
Or in Cyberfem.
What
are we doing?
So one of the Winx Club members and one of Bloom's friends, her name is Techna.
I want her to be me. I want me to be her.
She is the quote-unquote fairy of technology and techno-magic. I think this is super cool. And I think it reinforces STEM, particularly technology, as a magical, awesome, powerful thing rather than a boring, inaccessible thing.
Yeah, like hacker sitting in a dark room. Like, it can be exciting and fun.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really cool, kind of like that update to the elements. Like, I do not often see technology thought of as kind of like a building block of elemental mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
So it's exciting to bring that back in because it feels refreshed in a way that the classical elements do feel a bit archaic.
Mm.
And I think it suited Winx Club really well. You definitely couldn't have done it with like the lore and the cultural kind of backgrounds and the vibes they're going for in Avatar.
Mm-hmm.
But it fits so well in that teen series.
Yeah. So it reminded me of the famous Arthur C. Clarke quote.
Say it out loud.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. One of my favorite quotes ever.
I love that. That makes me feel like technology is filled with whimsy and the world is going to be okay.
Yes, and then it also made me think about this other idea, how we treat something as magical if we don't fully understand it. So maybe a science concept, a technological concept. And then it reminded me of an exercise we did in a very first science communication class.
And I've done this exercise in so many psychom classes since. It's Will's favorite.
Do you want to explain it?
You go, Isabel.
Where it's essentially you pair up with someone, and one of the people is pretending to be from Middle Ages.
Yeah, I think so.
And then you're from present day, and you've brought this like iPhone back, and have to explain to them that it's not a like magical
It's not a magical device.
Yeah.
You have to try not to get burned at the stake is
Yes.
kind of for witchcraft.
Yeah, exactly,
is the
for
vibe.
witchcraft. Mm.
And it's a really, really great exercise in understanding the ways in which you can communicate about something that isn't like how it is made and how it works to someone who doesn't have any grounding theories and is a really good exercise in how to understand your audience.
Yes, it is.
We love. It honestly is an exercise that doesn't get that much easier the more Psychom you understand, because it is such a tricky and complex and nuanced challenge, and that's what makes it enjoyable and meaningful as an exercise. I love it.
So, Winx Club, 11 out of 10. Yes. Pokemon, though, Ella.
Also an 11 out of 10. So, Winx Club should have been in some of our earlier episodes. Let's flash back to episode 1, Pokemon. Pop goes the Sneasel. We're using Pokemon, I guess, in this episode to talk about a dynamic that comes out of a lot of popular culture depictions of the classical elements, which is the rock, paper, scissors dynamic. And that is kind of like grounded in this theory that the elements have a strength and a weakness to each other, and therefore can be used mechanically in a very fun, interesting, easy to learn gameplay. So in Pokemon, you always start with one starter type. You get to pick between one grass type or a fire type or a water type. Grass kind of standing in here for ground, so that is both ground and earth types in Pokemon. But essentially, grass is weak to fire. Fire is weak to water. Water is weak to grass. So then it kind of brings into the game mechanics these elements of strategy to choose the best element for your opponent rather than the elements being hierarchical in who is most powerful overall. Yeah, so I think it's very interesting that Pokemon, again, such a highly permeated and well played, well loved, well known piece of popular culture, that the base game mechanic is kind of this rock, paper, scissors, Aristotelian elements vibe. And then they are one of the popular culture brands, I guess, or worlds that has expanded out of those core elements again. So they then introduce elements such as like ground and earth types, and then bug types, and then you get steel types, and you even get kind of like non-elements, more fairy, spiritual kind of Pokemon types, such as fairy and ghost, which I think is interesting, the tie back there into where classical elements sprung from. A lot of other popular culture uses this. Pokemon, not only a video game or an anime or movie or books, but very popularly also a card game.
Did it start as a card game? No. Yes?
What a question that I feel like I should have the answer to by now. I don't know. The card game is very fundamental to its spreading as a piece of popular culture. And other card games that use elements and this rock, paper, scissors mechanic include Yu-Gi-Oh!, very popular at the same time as Pokemon, and also Magic the Gathering, which I think is kind of aiming for a bit of an older audience. Has Isabel done a quick Google search?
Yeah, I'm just checking. It says it originated as a pair of role-playing games.
I think it originated as a game.
It was a Game Boy game.
Yeah.
And then turned into a manga series and a trading card game, an anime series, and everything else that Pokemon became.
Yeah, it's interesting because some people don't consider it an anime because it wasn't originally in that form, which I think is a super interesting way to be like, it has never been a part of the form because the first experience wasn't in this form, therefore it's not an anime, it's just an animated cartoon. That's super interesting to me. But interesting that it started as a game because another video game, Isabel, Potion Permeate.
Oh my gosh.
Isabel is bouncing around, listeners. She's like vibrating with happiness and joy.
I have been waiting for a chance to talk about this game for a little bit now.
Tell us all.
Thank you, Anay, for telling me about it. It gets me very excited, especially because of its links to science communication. So, brand new video game on PC and consoles. It's all about rebuilding trust in chemists and the medical community and science. Very psychom, very relevant, especially after the pandemic. Well, yes, I mean after the COVID pandemic and all of the vaccine hesitancy, and the mistrust in vaccines and medicine.
And experts in general
and
too.
Experts, yes. Yeah, so I just read the blurb for you. The town of Moonberry has always been wary of the advances of the outside world. There are reasons for this. If you play the game, you learn the reasons. Preferring to rely on their traditional methods of healing until one day when the mayor's daughter falls ill and the local witch doctor can't help her, they look outside their small community for help. The medical association sends their most accomplished chemist, you, to help cure the mayor's daughter and show the residents of Moonberry the wonders of modern alchemy. Gain their trust and tend to each person when they fall ill in this open-ended sim RPG.
This poor town where everyone's getting ill.
So definitely alchemy, Aristotle chemistry going on in this game. To make your curing potions, you gather and make use of the local ingredients, as that's like native plants, monster materials, and you arrange them by the classical Aristotelian elements, and certain combinations brew particular potions. Mm-hmm. So some recipes will only let you use specific classical elements and reject others. So for instance, only quote unquote water materials will be allowed.
For like one type of potion.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. But no fire materials. I love this game because of the focus on building relationships with the townsfolk. You as a scientific expert, not just coming in and like, here's the potion that I have that will cure all of you.
Where's your immediate trust in me and the system that I know is good, but I've given you no reason to believe.
Exactly. So you come in and you can't progress the game without working on your relationships with each individual resident. Amazing.
Honestly, that sounds so good.
Also, you get a dog, which is bonus points from me.
Bonus points to any game with a dog, and bonus points to any game that understands that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think the same can be applied to knowledge. Mm-hmm. Like how you communicate absolutely is more important than what you have to say sometimes. Mm-hmm. Because you have to give people a reason to trust you, to want to listen in the first place.
Exactly.
To understand where you're coming from and why it might be helpful.
Yeah, exactly. I just had a thought just now.
Tell me.
About another video game, Fireboy and Water Girl, which is
the
very
tower game?
Made me think of that, talking about the Elemental movie. Mm-hmm. That one, again, it's using two contrasting
elements,
classical elements who have to work together to solve a problem. Whoa, how did we not think about this when we were planning the episode?
I think I did have it as a thought, but I wasn't sure what to say about it. I guess in terms of like mechanics, there's certain parts you're like trying to get through like a tower, right?
Yeah.
There's like certain parts where the water girl has to go first to unlock a platform to make it safe for the other person.
Yes.
And I think it's very interesting the give and the take, because you can't complete it with only one of those two characters. It has to be both working together, and they are equally advantageous and have disadvantages thrown at them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really cool. Mm. And I think that actually is a very, very good lead-in.
I thought it might be.
To the wrap-up I want to do, going back to the new Pixar film, Elementals. We said the film was really, really good, and we mean it. And now I'm going to tell you mainly why. Mm-hmm. Like, there were so many great elements. The score by Thomas Newman, fantastic. We love. He did the Finding Nemo soundtrack too. The animation techniques were beautiful, appropriately heart-wrenching at times. But the best part was the idea, the storytelling, and how they did it. So the storyline of this movie hinges on the fact that we already understand the classical elements. Mm-hmm. that they have differences, that they interact in sometimes advantageous and sometimes disadvantageous ways. Like sometimes two elements combining, really cool. Sometimes it's disastrous. And this movie also unlocks like another bit, which is sometimes how they interact is unknown. And that can be really scary and can go to fear-mongering. And this movie uses elements kind of simply and a little subtly, but also not at all, to highlight racial bias and cultural bias and the impact that this has on immigration, communication with local council and law enforcement, how this impacts community building. And I thought very, very interestingly how this impacts accessibility and the differences people can have. In the movie, I guess the main character is this fire element. And we see her experience this wonderful solar punk world.
I was about to say, I was like, don't you forget it.
The world is so delightfully solar punk. Isabel and I kind of like screamed when we started watching it. It was great. But as the viewer, you see this world and you're like, wow, it looks so ideal and pure and wonderful. And then you see it through her eyes and you see how dangerous it is for her, that this city has not been created with her in mind. And that anytime she tries to go out of her comfort zone and interact with, I guess, kind of the powers that be and the controlling forces in the city, she's putting her livelihood on the line, her safety on the line. There's lots of like free-flowing water in this solar punk beautiful city that could quite simply like put her out and metaphorically kill her if she fell into it or got splashed a certain amount. And nobody else seems to take into account how dangerous that is for her. And it's such a great metaphor because it hinges on the elements and our understanding of them. Therefore, we understand, kind of like the baseline, and then we can make all these assumptions and growth and understand character arcs throughout the film because of our basis in elemental understanding or classical elemental understanding. And I think that was so, so clever.
Yeah,
and
completely.
I really like it. And I don't know why the film kind of advertised itself as a Romeo and Juliet situation, because what it actually was, I think, is so much more interesting. Yeah, I highly recommend you see the film. I hope by now it's out on streaming platforms, which might lower the barrier a bit of wanting to go and watch it.
Yeah, it might be on Disney Plus by the time this comes out.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Well worth a watch. I cried. I laughed. I dreamt of a solar punk.
It was just, it was a sweet movie with science concepts and a feel-good watch.
Yeah.
Underrated as well, I think.
Extremely underrated.
Go watch it. I think let's jump into our individual sections.
Yeah, I think so. That ended on such a nice note.
Did you want to kick us off with X-Men, Ella?
Yes, or X the Men, as I've written in my notes. I wanted to talk a little bit about superhero dynamics, strengths versus weaknesses, team-ups, etc. We've touched on throughout this episode how the elemental tropes are used in a lot of popular culture. Superhero comics, I think, almost use and abuse this trope. And look, X-Men, I love you. There is like a different X-Men for almost everything ever. I love you, Gambit, but like, are you necessary to...
I don't know, which one's Gambit? Which one's Gambit?
He's like the probability magic card trick.
Oh.
Yeah. Like, cool that he exists, but I have questions. I wanted to talk about what happens when you kind of like start off with this like classical elements, or you're like, I have to have some way to distinguish the powers of all these people. And then you're X-Men, so you keep adding more people. And more people and more people. And I want to talk about when this mechanism becomes unhelpful. Because I think X-Men is there.
Yeah. I think a lot of superhero franchises are there.
Yeah, and I think there's this interesting dynamic that comes when you lose the rock, paper, scissors dynamic. So there's no longer like a strategic play in terms of which powers go against which, even though that makes for very interesting visual scenes in comics and movie adaptations. And then you have to like step in with kind of like the bigger and bigger threat. And the X-Men does this through Omega level power mutants, basically saying like, yeah, there are a lot of people who can manipulate fire, but this one's the best. And I think that's fun. I think what's more fun is that in X-Men, it's kind of like more about using your powers strategically. So not necessarily that your power can overpower somebody else's one, but it's like the way in which you use your power to problem solve, which could be kind of like in the world of like subbending an avatar to control something they didn't expect you to control. Though in classic X-Men style, lots of these physical superhero powered fights do kind of become drawn out philosophical chats and debates to settle thoughts.
Fascinating.
Which is interesting because then it goes back around full circle to natural philosophy beginnings.
I have heard, so I haven't read I know I have read some superhero comics, but not much. I'm not a widely read person, but I know Marvel comics have a tendency to actually go into philosophical concepts. I'm not so sure about the movie and series, like live action adaptations, but I know because I know people who have read, for instance, the Incredible Hulk series, that there are entire volumes of him just like contemplating things, life, the meaning.
Yeah, and I think that is true for DC Comics and a lot of other superheroes too, because then I guess once you become a powered being, like if you are more than human or mutant, like human adjacent, but like better, quote unquote, in some way, like what does that mean? Like I think that's actually a philosophical question that we're like, haha, Superman, he can punch big. But like, what does it mean if he has all these powers but he can't save the person he likes? Like what is it worth? What do we owe each other?
Yeah.
I think that's where the interest lies. And I think, often left out of adaptations because
when it's like, to me,
it's
one of
not
the most
interesting to watch.
Which is sad because to me it's like that's almost more appealing, that sort of philosophical. So I feel like they should do that. That would bring something fresh to the superhero movies.
Yeah.
Well, they sort of did actually, didn't they, with some of the Avengers?
Yeah, but
movies.
Not in a satisfying way, I would say. I felt there needs to be more. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect. Not a little. There is a disconnect between the adaptations and their source material. And I actually have some ideas for that I'm going to bring up in our next episode.
Ooh.
And with that teaser in mind, Isabel, what's your individual section about today?
Yes. So I want to talk about science and love stories today. Two things you wouldn't think you see together.
I don't know. I've seen some pretty atrocious science love puns.
Well, that's what I'm going to get into as well,
so
actually.
Good. Okay, let's go.
So, and using science concepts as metaphors for connection and describing compatibility in romantic relationships, friendships, family relationships. Yes, yes. So I would like to start with the phrase chemistry.
And how me and you have so much of it.
We do a lot. How this is a science term.
Sure is.
That we use to describe people's compatibility with each other. Usually romantic, but also in multiple other.
Also, if you just happen to be like really good friends and podcast hosts.
Yeah. And also the typical rom-com idea of opposites attracting too.
So true.
Yeah, which is, again, a science chemistry concept drawn from the ionic chemical bond, which is where different charges, so positive and negative, complete each other and fill spaces that might be lacking.
Like how magnets pull to each other.
Yes, because like and like repel.
Yeah, so you want a positive and a negative, and that is attractive.
Exactly. And the movie Elemental is actually Pixar's first rom-com.
Stop it. Okay, we'll rewatch it. Fine.
And I think it's an interesting example of this idea where they've taken it to almost the literal level of using these science concepts to explore connection and romantic themes. So like Ella said earlier, the movie's been described as a fantastical, kid-friendly Romeo and Juliet. And it ultimately asks the question of how do you create chemistry between two elements or characters, fire and water, who don't typically mix.
Or who are thought not to mix.
Yes.
As in like that's kind of like a plot point in this movie of they haven't tried but they don't think they'll mix.
Mm-hmm. And they have some cool sort of sciencey things when they're trying to, touch. And
or they're really close to each other.
Yeah, and it's sweet and sad at the same time where she's like, her hand's really close to his hand. It's like boiling his water and she is gonna like put her fire out as well if he gets too close.
Both kind of uncomfy, but they're still trying because they want connection.
Yeah,
my little heart.
Another interesting thing is these tensions between Ember and Wade and Ember's family also mirrors the director's life experiences, which Ella also kind of touched on earlier. So mainly of his experiences marrying a non-Korean woman and all the culture clashes that come with that and his family's initial resistance to it. And a little bit of a movie spoiler here, but in the movie, Ember's grandma, her dying words are "marry fire," and the director's grandma, her dying words were apparently "marry Korean."
Hey, that seems very closely related.
But it also mirrors his experiences of growing up in New York City in America with Korean immigrant parents who didn't have much money, no family around, and barely spoke English, but created a wonderful, beautiful life for themselves and for their children, just like Ember's parents. And how cool that they used ideas from science to explore these themes.
Yeah, it's very interesting that that's the way they chose to impart the meaning.
So when I think about the movie, there's a few different love stories, actually. So there's the romantic love story between Wade and Ember. There's the family love story. And there's also the bigger community love story about creating connection and acceptance. Where elements who may not typically mix can interact and live together in harmony.
Aww. That's so sweet. What a special podcast episode. Audience, I hope you feel warm and fuzzy after listening to this. Warm and fuzzy enough that you might answer some questions we have for you. We'd love to know if you had to pick what your favorite elemental superpower would be.
Yeah.
Would it be a classical elemental superpower? Would it be one of earth, air, water, fire? Or is it maybe related to the periodic table of elements? Let us know on our socials at @sci_burst on all your favorite platforms.
Also, you can reach us on Gmail if you don't have the socials, or maybe you'd prefer just us to see it.
Yeah, let us know.
So you can, Gmail is sciburstpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay nerdy, friends.
Stay nerdy, and we'll see you next time.
Sure will.
Thank you to ANU CPAS for their support and access to their podcast studio.